Very good afternoon to all of you. And at the outset, I would like to thank the Society of Fetal Medicine and the seniors from the Society of Fetal Medicine, Dr. Ashok Khurana and Dr. Keelan Parveen, to actually think about this panel, which is counseling following a prenatal diagnosis of congenital heart disease. And with me in this panel is very esteemed guest faculty, starting with Dr. Balu Vaidyanathan, who's a renowned pediatric cardiologist from Kochi, who wants to go beyond diagnosing cardiac disorders in the fetus and the child and actually treat the correctable cardiac disorders in the child so that their outcome is improved. And I must acknowledge that he has helped me conduct and actually prepare this panel. We also have with us Dr. Uttam Preet Singh, who's a very senior consultant cardiologist from Chandigarh. And we hope to have his opinion on management of pediatric cardiac disorders in this panel. We, of course, have Dr. Bimal Sani, who's conducted the quiz so well this morning, has been moderating these sessions. And Sir is a pillar of strength for Society of Fetal Medicine, the president-elect. And Sir, you are the radiologist for this panel with us today. We have with us Dr. Bijoy, who's the lead for the Fetal Medicine Center in Simar from Kochi. And Bijoy is a dynamic personality, and we hope to have good insights from you for this panel. And Dr. Vivek, who's a fetal medicine specialist from the Amrita Institute, is very meticulous, and we are looking forward to your participation in this panel. And of course, we have Dr. Reema Bhatt, who's a maternal fetal medicine specialist from the RNR in Delhi. And her specialty is fetal interventions, but her specialty is also empathy, which is particularly very important for this kind of a panel where we would be discussing counseling for patients whose babies have been diagnosed with fetal cardiac anomalies. Well, we've heard Dr. Rabi speaking, and when he speaks, it's actually like magic. And when he says, we can scan, it really looks like magic. But it's really also important to come back to reality and talk about the problem with fetal heart in numbers. And when we actually talk about fetal heart in numbers, we have to know that it is the fetal congenital heart disease are actually 0.8%, 8 per thousand. But if we look at the congenital malformations, the proportion of heart disease is actually a whooping 33%. And those requiring critical intervention is 25%. So this is the proportion of change that we can actually bring about. And if we do a proper management, then we can actually have a survival which is close to 90%. And the burden in India alone is 2.5 lakh children that we are talking about, contributing to 10% of infant mortality. And I was just talking about the numbers that are attending the conference today. The virtual conference is close to 1,500 people of obstetricians, fetal medicine specialists, and radiologists. So if today we decide that we are going to have a proper management of congenital heart disease, babies born with that, we can actually bring about a significant change in the outcome of these babies who can be saved. But what is the cornerstone for management? And that remains teamwork. And this panel here is here to discuss the actual approach to management of these cases. So actually the plan starts with the primary care provider, which is an obstetrician, who would be advising an antenatal scan at the correct time. And the radiologist or a fetal medicine person who's probably detecting the cardiac disease with a diagnostic clue or giving the prognostic markers. And then the ball is in the court of a fetal medicine person or a geneticist who would actually look for the extra cardiac or the genetic associations, which would further prognosticate the case. And then comes the role of a cardiologist who would tell us about the cardiac disorder, the prognosis, and what really happens in a postnatal period. And then comes the critical role of a pediatric cardiologist in conjunction with an obstetrician, whether a perinatal care is required. So all of them together have their own role to play in counseling. And this is what we are going to discuss today. Before we go on, some basic genetics, that if a child is born with a congenital heart disease, there is 5 to 15% association with chromosomal, while a fetus has 30 to 40% association. And some of the CHDs like TGA and heterotraxes have least association with chromosomal abnormalities. The syndromic association is seen in 30%, while 75% are isolated. If it is an isolated, the recurrence risk is like 1 to 5%. Now, why I'm telling is that, these are some of the numbers. If these are etched in our minds, it's very easy to talk to the patients and, tell them, okay, this is going to happen. And these are some of the common syndromes which are hugely associated with congenital heart disease that should be thought about when we come across patients who are carrying fetuses with congenital heart disease. So, what are the management options? Are we actually thinking about terminating pregnancy? Is the heart disease so severe as to terminate pregnancy? If not, is it legally possible to terminate pregnancy? If it does not warrant a terminate pregnancy, does it require a immediate postnatal care or does it require a palliative care? So these are the management options that we really need to discuss. So with the fetal diagnosis of CHD, are there any cardiac, extracardiac genetic associations? If does it really require a termination of pregnancy? If yes, is it legally possible within the legal confines of our country? If yes, go ahead and do the termination. If not, is palliation possible and is palliation available? If it does not require a termination, does it need an in utero follow-up? And does it need a critical perinatal intervention? If yes, decide the place and time of delivery. And if it requires a perinatal intervention, which is the center that we are referring to? What is the institutional experience and outcome? What is the initial cost and recurring cost? So these are some of the points that our able panelists are going to discuss these points. I would again reiterate the fact that the objective of the panel today is not to discuss the four basic cases, and that we have put forward. The objective is to have a template in our mind on what to do when we come across a case of a congenital heart disease in the fetus. So that is the only objective of this panel, which I'm sure is going to come across as we discuss the case. So here we start the first case. She is a 27-year-old second gravida who presented at 19 weeks with an abnormal four-chamber view. Now, this is the four-chamber view, and this is presented to the radiologist. Now, I am very comfortably sitting today in the role of an obstetrician and a primary caregiver, and I throw this image at my radiologist colleague, Dr. Bimal, and I would request him to comment on this picture. Sir, this is, it's open for you to comment.
Aparna, thank you very much. See, right from the first image, the first thing actually that strikes you straight away is that there is a ventricular chamber discrepancy. So what you're seeing is a ventricular chamber discrepancy. You're finding that the LV is small. Now, Dr. Ravi has already taken us through the, once you have an LV which is small, then you think, commonly think of only two things. One is the hypoplastic left heart syndrome, and then the second is an obstruction to the LVOT. So coarctation is the second thing that you think of. But in this case, what we also have is that the LV is small, very small, hypoplastic. Then it is not only that, you can see that there are echogenic rim of the LV, which is suggestive of endocardial fibrinoelastosis. And a very important point that one needs to make out is that the apex of the heart in this is predominantly formed by the right ventricle. So that is one important clue which gives us, telling us that we are dealing with a hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And then, of course, when you put in color, yes, you were not going to, you may either see no flow across the mitral valve, or probably you would see very minimal flow with regurgitation there. And when we try to look into the left ventricular outflow tract, we may not be able to see the, so maybe, okay, because you already put in the other four-chamber view image there, the left atrium may be small, and what you would find is that there is a flow shunt from the left to the right, and that is why the atrial septum or the flap of the foramen ovale you will see bulging into the right atrium, which normally bulges into the left atrium, because the flow what is coming in is not able to go into the ventricle. It finds a way to the right side, and Then you look into the LVOT and you would find that you probably, in most of the cases, you may not be able to see the ascending aorta at all. And even in the three vessel view, you may find that the transverse aortic arch is very narrow. And when you put in color, you would find that there is a reversal of flow in the transverse aortic arch or the isthmus. Now, all these things straight away point out that we are dealing with a hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And as a radiologist now, because see, we are talking about counseling, and maybe this patient may go to a cardiologist for an opinion on counseling on what to do. There are two other important things that also you need to look for: whether the foramen ovale is restrictive, whether it has become restrictive, and also you need to look for the pulmonary veins, because you may find that there is in diastole, you may find there's a reversal of flow in the pulmonary.
So, sir, yes, I agree, sir. And I think this particular part will also tell us whether the prognosis is good. So here, sir, actually what I would really like to know also is, because this is something that is going to, she came to us as 19 weeks. And because this is a poor prognostic heart lesion and the lesion has already progressed to this phase. So I would just try to kind of also know whether, the associations with the heart, and also because of the next thing. So thank you, sir, because this is a diagnosis of, it's a clear diagnosis. And I think Dr. Rabi also detailed in it. And I will also go to the next part, sir. That is, what would be the association? So we have with us Dr. Vivek here. Dr. Vivek, are you there?
Yes, Dr. Aparna.
Yes, sir. So, Dr. Vivek, would you like to tell us about the associations there? Because it is very important to understand if there would be any genetic or extracardiac associations in this situation.
Yes, thank you, Aparna. First of all, let me thank the SFM for this wonderful opportunity. Good afternoon to all the co-panelists. Good afternoon to the delegates. And good morning to Professor Rabi. It's a great honor, as Dr. Aparna said, to be part of this panel with all legends and stalwarts sitting here. Now, coming to your question, see, when you think about hypoplastic left heart syndrome, I think the first point that we need to understand is that 3 out of 4 times this is going to be seen as an isolated abnormality. So what we would generally do when you see a hypoplastic left heart syndrome at the anomaly scan is do an extended scan to try and look for other associations. And if possible, if she's done a first trimester scan, review the images, look for signs of any abnormalities. If she's done a trimester screening test, review those reports as well. And if you find nothing suspicious, we would just rather leave her alone without any further testing. But the other 1/4 could have some kind of an association. These associations could be either cardiac abnormalities or extracardiac anomalies, and that would predominantly, I guess, depend on what type of HLHs we're talking about. Because if it's a classical HLHs where you have the typical mitral atresia, aortic atresia with a left ventricle that is hardly visible, then extracardiac anomalies would predominate. But if it's the other type of HLHs with the aortic stenosis being the predominant lesion, and then you would see more of intracardiac anomalies, maybe something like aortic insufficiency, tricuspid insufficiency, and so on and so forth. But if it's the classical HLHs that we're concerned about, these mostly present with extracardiac associations, if at all there are any. And talking of these extracardiac anomalies, any particular system can be affected. There is no predilection to any particular system. But sometimes if you're careful enough and if you look closely enough, you might pick up on a pattern that is suggestive of a chromosomal abnormality. Say, for example, if you find a hypoplastic left heart in the setting of, let's say, a cystic hygroma or a hydrops, non-immune hydrops fetalis, then probably you would think of Turner syndrome. You might at times see findings in the brain. You might see a brachycephalic skull. You might see posterior fossa anomalies, cerebellar hypoplasia, single umbilical artery, or you might see a limb anomaly like, let's say, a clenched fist with a pointing finger or a club foot. Then you might think of trisomy 18. Or on the other hand, if you have a growth restricted baby with polydactyly and midline abnormalities, echogenic kidneys, then you think in terms of trisomy 13. Now, but remember, as you've shown in this particular slide, chromosomal abnormalities are extremely rare with hypoplastic left heart, just around 4 to 5%. But if you find any of these abnormalities, you would rather want to do an invasive testing. But otherwise, hypoplastic left heart is mostly a sporadic abnormality. You would not want to put a needle unless you find one of these associations.
Right.
Yes,
Thank you.
and
So with that, I'd like to go to the next question. So thank you, Vivek. So Bijoy, Dr. Bijoy, you're here.
Yeah, I'm here.
So I would just like to just take it from where Vivek left us. So which, if you plan to do an invasive testing, so in this particular thing, and I think this applies to all of the tests which we would be thinking of doing if there is a cardiac defect. So which test would you like to offer, in this case, if you do plan to do a test?
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Am I heard? Yes. Yeah. Thank you, SFM, for this opportunity and for putting up this wonderful conference. I totally agree with what Vivek was just saying right now about the associations being extremely rare. But what we would normally do in our center is that when we have a congenital heart disease, and especially of this kind, where we are definitely going in for termination, or most likely because you have a HLHS with just one ventricle that is functioning, we always do put in a needle, and we do karyotyping and store off DNA for further evaluation if at all it is required. Because even though the chromosomal associations are less, there is a slight association with microdeletions and duplications that are present in HLHS, and which you may completely miss out on. And so it's always best to store the DNA and do the karyotype. So for any congenital heart disease for that matter, except for maybe an isolated VSD, what we normally do in our center is that we normally do an amniocentesis, do a karyotype, store the DNA, and if the patient is continuing the pregnancy, we tell them that there is a possibility of having microdeletions or duplications which can be missed out on your karyotype. And if they want to go ahead and do further testing, we do further testing on that. But if they do opt for termination, then we store their DNA and say that let's let this pregnancy get over, and we'll think about what to do in the next pregnancy. We can do further testing so that you are prepared and you know exactly what's happening in your pregnancy and why you had this particular abnormality. But one thing I would like to say is that never offer NIPT for a structural congenital heart disease, because if you have a congenital heart disease, doing an NIPT is of particularly no use, because it's a screening test, and screening is not what we want to do when you pick up a congenital heart disease. Yeah.
So thank you, Vijay. I think that was one message we wanted to get across, and you said it very, very clearly that NIPT is not something that you should offer when it's a structural heart disease. So we're coming to the next question, Dr. Uttampreet Singh, sir. Would you? So this is your role, and we would just like to give you an O, because this is HLHS, and we know that we have to move towards more correctable disorders we would like to talk about, and the couple would really want to go for termination. So could you just give us a quick overview about how the disease behaves and what are the treatment options if the patient had come late, or how does this disease behave in a postnatal period?
I think I'll take 30 minutes beginning to say hats off to Dr. Ashok, Dr. Rabi, who, whichever side the wind blows, they know how to adjust their sails and continue the yacht in the absolutely same direction in a good speed. And thanks for making me a part of that yacht today. Now, I think the very first thing we need to know, I would, whenever I'm going to answer this, my obstetrician who's counseling wants to know a couple of things. The very first thing the obstetrician wants to know whether the thing is likely to progress. Yes, we have seen aortic stenosis progressing to HLHS, but in our case, we had already developed HLHS. Now, second thing they want to know is that, can we do something in utero? Yes, we can, but there is a very small subset of patients in that transition of development of HLHS in a full-fledged form. You do pass through a stage where there is an aortic stenosis, there is a mitral stenosis, and LV is large, it's ballooned out with the fibrolastosis. This is probably the stage that we can actually intervene, do a balloon atrial valvoplasty and open up so that the LV starts recovering, and we have a better outcome for that. The next question they want to know, where should delivery be done? So I would have no doubt that delivery should be done in a tertiary care unit. I mean, there could be restrictions. Patient may not want to continue the pregnancy. They might take a different decision. But, if the surgery, the delivery is done, should be done in a tertiary care unit, because this is a, ductal restriction category. This is a category where you have a duct dependent circulation. And then fossa valis restriction, as Dr. Bimal rightly pointed out, if you have a fossa valis restricted, which can be, let's say the the reversal flow divided by the forward flow is less than 20%, large S wave, small D wave, and a very large reversed A wave, or, if you can see fossa is less than 3 millimeter, or a gradient is more than 5, in all those situations, there is a very critical thing that is going to happen when the child is going to be born. You have a situation like a critical mitral stenosis. You have an LV where, it's all small. You have a fossa which is restricted. Pulmonary blood has nowhere to go. That creates a very critical situation. That time, the balloon atrial septostomy has to be done within hours of a child birth. And even once a child is born, like he rightly said, if you have a pulmonary venous hypertension due to due to fossa restriction, and in this situation there is arterialization of the pulmonary veins, which makes all the surgeries difficult. So that is what. So now, next thing they want to know, would the child require surgery? And if yes, then single or multiple? Now the answer is that child would require surgery, and would be a complex surgery, would be at a very high tertiary care center, would require a multiple surgeries, at least the 3 surgeries, if not more. And despite that, they want to know what is the quality of life and survival. Both are not good. The life expectancy is poor. More than that, there is a recent concept of neurocognitive dysfunctions in these patients, and as well as in patients of TGA. Probably I'll discuss that in some next patient, that what are the neurocognitive functions which again would help the obstetrician to counsel the patient. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that advice. And I think this is what we are looking for, that the outcome is not going to be good. So with that, doctor, we come to the last part of this discussion, that Dr. Rima, this patient has come to you now with after visiting everybody. So how would you counsel this patient regarding pregnancy management? Dr. Rima, you have to unmute yourself.
So, thank you, Dr. Aparna, for this question. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So, in this case, what you mentioned was a spontaneous conception. But at the beginning, I would like to say that we asked 3 important questions when we have a case of hypoplastic left heart. It's a spontaneous conception, or is it an IVF conception? We want to know the POG. This was 19 weeks, definitely. And then we need to look at the resource poor setting or a resource rich setting that we are looking at. As Bijoy mentioned, we would definitely do invasive testing for this patient, do a microarray and do DNA preservation. But what is important is that we need to reiterate what Dr. UP said about the poor prognosis on these babies. So when I plan their delivery, if there's some subset of the IVF conceptions who, in spite of repeated counseling, decide to continue with the pregnancy, in that case, we need to tell them that the prognosis is not good, plan their delivery at term. The mode of delivery would be a vaginal delivery. Cesarean section would only be for an obstetric indication. And another counseling that goes is that when we tell them about cesarean section in case of fetal distress, if it happens intrapartum, we need to be very sure of telling them that we will not do that. Mother is most important, and we need to re-emphasize this point. And another important thing is the social build-up for this patient, as far as we need to handle them very empathically. We need to keep telling them that this baby can die anytime. It could be intrapartum, it could be intrauterine, it could be postnatal, it could be pre-surgery, post-surgery. All this has to be told again and again. So this is what this is how I would want to deal with a hypoplastic left heart baby.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Rima. I think that was very clear. So before we end this case, I have some very quick questions for Dr. Balu. Sir, this patient, sir, are you here, sir? Can I unmute? Can you unmute yourself?
I think I can hear you, and I can see all of you also.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So, sir, what if she had come late at, say, 26 or 27 weeks? She came at 19 weeks. She has an option of termination of pregnancy. So I think some of the panelists have also said, and what Dr. Rima also said, but just could you just summarize it?
Yeah, I mean, late presenters are pretty common in our context. Majority of the diagnoses are made sometime in mid-trimester. So it leaves all of us in a significant dilemma regarding what is the right ethical course of actions. We have the MTP rule, which I think a bill has been passed in the parliament, seeking to amend it further to 24 weeks. But as things stand now, the gestational limit for termination is 20 weeks. So latecomers, of course, is a big problem for everyone. What I do is I tell the family about the options. There is no in utero management for hyperplastic left heart syndrome, except if the foramen ovale is restrictive. Few centers have tried balloon atrial septostomy in utero. There is no question of doing an aortic valve dilatation once the hyperplastic left heart is already settled. Aortic stenosis with LV dilatation is a completely different disease. Please do not confuse between the two. Now, once the baby is born, we are dealing with a critical duct-dependent heart defect. So if the child has to survive, the only option is to go for surgery. And as you correctly showed in your pictures, there are 3 minimal steps, starting with the first stage Norwood operation, followed by the Glenn and the Fontan. The second and the third stages are the same as for any single ventricle. Our center has done close to about 80 to 100 Norwood procedures. I should say that this is very resource intensive. It really costs a lot of money, a lot of effort, and the success rates are around 70-75% in our center. And it's not just success. Surgery and sending the baby home is not the only thing. We also have a very high interstage mortality between the first and the second stages. And as you showed in your slides about prognosis, and as the data shows, about 50% of the single ventricles and the Fontans following hyperplastic left heart will go in for a Fontan failure by the time they are about 20. That's the data from Australia and New Zealand that says. So overall, you are looking at the extreme picture. And I think what you people all should do is try and endeavor to pick this condition earlier in the pregnancy so that more options can be given to the family. And regarding the risk of recurrence, yes, there is a possibility of a recurrence risk. And that is when seriously the possibility of genetic tests and karyotyping and the routine tests may not help you. You'll have to go for very specialized tests, maybe microarray. And I think once Dr. Indrani presented a case where there were 3 or 4 consecutive siblings in the family who had HLHS or similar conditions, even bicuspid aortic valve can share some of the genes with HLHS. So maybe we should look for that. So these are my thoughts. I don't have great answers to these questions.
No, so thank you, sir, for making that very clear. And I must tell you, we were having very interesting questions coming in on the chat, but I think we will go on to the next case and then take up these questions a little later. So, so just to go back to our stepwise approach, as I said, any cardiac, extracardiac or genetic associations, we have made it clear that there could be for which we need to have testing, even if they're undergoing termination. DNA storage is a good idea. Does it warrant termination? If she's within the legal limits of termination of our country, we should strongly advise for it, unless the patient really wants to continue the pregnancy, and palliative treatment is possible at the appropriate centers, and we should go ahead and do it. And the important message, as Dr. Rabi has been also saying, that the diagnosis is possible on a 4-chamber view, and it is, if it is possible, it should be diagnosed early, and termination is when the termination is possible. So this really wraps up the first case, and with that we move to the second case, which is she is again within the window of 18 weeks pregnancy, and this particular view is this. So now we come to our imaging specialist, Dr. Bimal. Sir, your views, please.
Yeah. So straight away, what we see in diastole is that there is a large defect in the center of the heart or crux of the heart. So, and when we see in systole, what we are seeing is that there is, you can make out there is linear insertion of the valves, there is doming, and one thing which Dr. Rabi made a mention of, and which actually in my practice, I use it quite a lot. Something which just strikes you is the atrioventricular length ratio. And here, because normally the atrial length is less than 50% of the ventricular length. And here what you can see is that this definitely the atrial length is not less than the 50%. So if you take an AVL ratio, and if it is more than 0.6, then 80% of them would have an AV canal defect. So a defect in the crux of the heart, linear insertion, again very important. Then when you put in color, you would find that there is, in fact, there is a single flow which is going in, and then which is, going into both the ventricles there. And when you would find that there is a regurgent jet, which Dr. Rabi spoke about when you have a single AV valve. So these are all the features there.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. And I think we just had Dr. Rabi talking about this. As I said, hearing him is really magic. And we just heard him about talking about this case. So just talking about the count.
One last thing is that, okay, you can't just end your, making a diagnosis of AVSD, because we really need to look at the outflows, and because of a strong association with conotruncal abnormalities also.
Yes. So, and then the types of AZ. So from here, we will move on to what is very, very important in this particular case. And for that, I would like to invite Vivek to talk about the associations, the cardiac, extracardiac, and the genetic associations. So Vivek, would you like to expand upon it?
Yes, Aparna. So unlike the previous conditions we discussed, hyperplastic left heart, where associations are rather the exception than the rule, when you come to AVSD, it's quite the opposite, because there are a few statistics that we need to remember. If you ask me which is the most common cardiac anomalies, it is the septal defects put together, ASD, VSD, and AVSD. If you ask me which is a cardiac anomaly that has got the highest association with the chromosomal abnormality, that again is septal defects. If you look at it from the other side, if you take the three common trisomies, 21, 18, and 13, and ask me which is the most common congenital heart disease that is linked to either of these, then there again it is septal defects. And amongst the septal defects that you see, it is, as Professor Rabi rightly pointed out, that the AVSD that is most likely to be associated with chromosomal abnormalities. If you compare it with ASDs and VSDs, I think AVSDs are much more commonly associated with aneuploidies than roughly around 3 times that you would see with ASD and 4 times that you would see with VSDs. So if you take AVSDs alone, again, there are a few numbers that we need to remember. As is written very clearly in Rabi's book, Professor Rabi's book, roughly around 60 to 70% of AVSDs, if I remember right, have an association with aneuploidies. And most commonly, as he said in his previous talk, the association is indeed with trisomy 21, especially if it is a complete and a balanced AVSD that we are looking at. There is also this 40% rule, as you've mentioned in this particular slide. 40% of trisomy 21s we know have congenital heart disease, and of this 40% is going to be AVSDs. So that is the 40% rule. So generally, unlike with HLHS, there's no question of doing further testing here. You would have to do an amniocentesis and would do a karyotyping as well as store DNA, because it's not just karyotypic abnormalities. Even single gene disorders have been associated or have AVSD as part of a lot of them. So you would do a karyotyping or a microarray better, and would store DNA as well to do further testing. The only exception perhaps would be, as Professor Rabi again said, is when you have AVSD in association with a heterotaxy. But there again, if your karyotype may not show much, your microarray certainly can pick up one of the other abnormalities. And as you've shown in the previous slide, I think intracardiac associations are also not uncommon. You have a lot of them, as you had shown, conotruncal anomalies, as Dr. Bimal Sahni was just mentioning. But again, going back to what Professor Rabi said, some of these AVSDs, especially if you have an unbalanced AVSD, that of course predisposes for hyperplasia or a smallness of one of the ventricles. And sometimes if the left ventricle is involved and you have an associated abnormality of the aorta, you could end up with a hyperplastic left heart kind of hemodynamics there. Aparna.
Yeah, thank you, Vivek. So I'll just take this quick question from Bijoy. That, okay, so I know that AVSD, we have classically read AVSD Downs, AVSD, it really says that, okay, this is going to be genetic. Now, she came late, probably, she did not come at 18 weeks and she came late. Now she's continuing the pregnancy. Is there any point of, following up this pregnancy? She can't terminate this pregnancy. She's 26, 28 weeks. And so she came late. So is there any point of following this up, and what is the risk of recurrence? Is it any different from HLH? So we need to understand and tell this to the patient. She's very keen. She's very anxious to know whether she needs to come again and again, and what is the risk in this pregnancy. Bijoy.
It's not just after 20 weeks. I just want to stress a couple of points on if you get an isolated AVSD, you did your karyotyping, all those things you did normal, no extra cardiac anomalies, nothing is there. In spite of that, I want you to remember three important things. The first thing is these babies can develop hydrops later on. It depends upon the degree of regurgitation that is present. So that is one thing that has to be very careful. Isolated AVSD with regurgitation can cause hydrops. So that's one point that you have to look at, and it should go into your counseling, and you should watch out for these babies developing hydrops or not. The second point is that you have an obligatory left to right shunt in AVSDs. So this obligatory left to right shunt decreases the flow across the aortic isthmus, and some of these aortic isthmus can contract later on and cause a coactation. So in AVSD, again, coactation is the second thing that you have to be worried about. So if you're classifying it as isolated at 20 weeks, you have to look out for developing coactation later on. The third thing is that AVSD is commonly associated with left atrial isomerism. And left atrial isomerism is very deceptive in the sense that you might not find anything else. You might find the stomach on the left side, the heart on the left side, everything is okay. And only thing that you would probably find is an AV canal defect. And it is possible to even have a completely normal heart in left atrial isomerism. So again, those things, to be very careful that if you're actually calling it isolated or not, you need to go and look at all these things. And once you have done all that, your karyotype is done, everything is normal, and you're following up for these specific complications, I would definitely ask the pregnancy, you can continue the pregnancy. There is nothing like AV canal is totally not correctable. It is correctable abnormality. And if it comes after 20 weeks, definitely you can counsel in terms of continuation of pregnancy. Yeah.
Thank you, Bijoy. I think that was a very strong message here that unlike HLH, AVSD is not something, if it is isolated, doesn't really warrant termination of pregnancy. It has a prognosis which is better. So on this point, I would like to invite Dr. UP Singh to talk about, how does the disease prognosis of this particular disorder do postnatally? Sir, Dr. UP Singh.
I think I would carry forward the message which is already given by Bijoy. Now, the progression, as he rightly said, that in a minority of patients, the very first question the obstetrician wants to know, does it progress? Yes, in certain cases it does, like valve regurgitation, or you have any other associations. But now the next question, which always we want to ask, is that the delivery, should it be done in a tertiary care unit? Unlike HLHS, the delivery may not be required to be done in a majority of patients in a tertiary care center, except for the cases where you have a hydrops, or you have a severe valvular regurgitation, or you have a severe obstructive lesions associated with AVSD. The next question again in that sequence, is it operable? Yes, it is operable. Doctor, I think what we can suggest before it is taken by further by the surgical association is that it depends upon multiple factors, when it's operable or not. Like rightly said, the very most important thing is that the association, is it associated with a Down syndrome? Is it associated with the heterotaxy? And are there intracardiac associations as well? Are they associated with the outflow abnormalities? Now, is the this AVSD, is it a balanced one or an unbalanced one? I think I would leave that to further comments. Then the issue becomes that the quality of life, after surgery and everything is done, do we have a good quality of life? I say it in majority of patients in AVSD surgery, the quality of life is okay. But in minority where you have plenty of associations, so it all depends upon what kind of a total syndrome we have. So it's not a AVSD as a single individual entity. Now, if the complexity of surgery is there and you end up doing a single ventricle repair or 1.5 ventricle repair, the outlook or quality of life is very different. If you have a residual valve regurgitation, the quality of life again is very different. So the quality of life and life expectancy actually depends upon what syndromes are we dealing with. For example, in the Down syndrome, you have plenty of other problems like oropharyngeal problem, recurrent respiratory tract infections. You have increased incidence of pulmonary vascular resistance. So all that actually plays a very important role in final outcome of the patient's
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So I think that is the message that we wanted to give across, that isolated, it is a better outcome. If it is, kind of associated with other syndromes, there might be a problem. So Dr. Rima, coming to you now. So how would you counsel the couple regarding pregnancy management? Please unmute yourself, Dr. Rima.
So the most important thing is that we've already discussed the association with different extracardiac and the chromosomal abnormalities. We definitely advise an invasive, do a microarray preferably, and DNA storage. As far as continuing pregnancy is concerned, if it's it's an isolated lesion with no extracardiac abnormalities, the chromosomes are fine, but as Bijoy mentioned, we have to give them the rider that we need to follow up this pregnancy more closely and we cannot completely prognosticate. And decision lies with the couple to continue or not to continue. Secondly, if it's an unbalanced AVSD, even if the chromosomes are normal, we have to tell them about the need for repeated surgeries, repeat a long-term follow-up, and again, the decision lies with the couple. As far as the place of delivery is concerned, well, if it's, we can plan delivery at a different center if it's difficult for them to follow up in a cardiac center, but a pediatric cardiology needs to be in loop. And 3 to 4 weeks later, they can follow up with a pediatric cardiologist. As far as the time of delivery is concerned, well, we aim a term delivery. Our mode of delivery is vaginal. We do cesarean only for an obstetric indication. And again, an important counseling that I give to my patients is that in case there is fetal distress in this patient, we can go for cesarean section, unlike the last case of a hypoplastic, where we prefer to have an IUD and not take the patient up for cesarean section. We give them the choice of cesarean because we know that this baby is amenable to treatment.
Thank you, Dr. Rima. So Dr. Balu, I would just like you to go back to our template and just comment and summarize this case before we go on to the next case. So does it warrant a termination of pregnancy, and what are the good and the bad prognostic factors?
Of course, regarding termination, I am no person to tell you that. I'm not an obstetrician to decide such matters. As far as I am concerned, if you have a balanced AV septal defect, that's a different entity. Unbalanced AV septal defect, as Professor Rabi said, it's a completely different ballgame. It's grouped under more of a single ventricle under us. For balanced AV septal defect, sometimes you can have an outflow obstruction, like pulmonic stenosis, which we call TED canal or AVSD with pulmonic stenosis. Now, for balanced AV septal defect from a surgical perspective, the outcomes are very good. The operative success is about 95%. There is a 10% chance of recurrence of either a left ventricular outflow tract obstruction, typically aortic stenosis level, or mitral regurgitation. And even those are usually amenable. The prognosis is very good. And as Dr. U.P. Singh said, the long-term outcomes are more likely to be determined by the associated factors than the cardiac condition. Unbalanced AV septal is obviously a completely different ballgame, which is heterotaxy, and there the prognosis is obviously more guarded, and the patient will require multiple operations. I don't think a balanced AV septal defect with no hydrops, no outflow obstruction needs to be delivered in a pediatric cardiac center. I'll be very happy to see the baby about a couple of weeks after birth to do the echo and decide the postnatal care. So decisions regarding,
thank you.
That's all. I think I should not take away your time. You have 2 more cases, right?
No, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for summarizing it so beautifully. I think that summarizes our management of AVSD. So with that, we move on to the next case. Again, coming back to Dr. Bimal, sir, this is your image for the day. So please discuss it.
Yeah, so we have a 5-chamber view, which is showing us a malaligned VSD with aortic root override. And also when I see the 3-vessel view, you're seeing that the pulmonary artery is narrow. So primarily dealing with two things which are straight. The most important thing that happens here is that I have a finding of a mala line VSD with override. I would probably put in color and also confirm that, because I will always see the typical Y sign there. And now, once I have this finding, I have to think of tetralogy of Fallot. I have to think of the pulmonary atresia with VSD. I have to think of TOF. I have to think of, I have to think of absent pulmonary valve syndrome. I have to think of CAT. So everything eventually will depend upon where is the pulmonary artery arising from and what is the direction of the flow. So here, definitely what I am seeing is that the pulmonary artery is arising from the RV. And the second important thing is that it is narrow. So I have 2 points. And third is, if there is, of course, there's no image of color in the 3VT, but if I find that there is a antegrade flow, I will start thinking in terms of tetralogy of Fallot. And we have images here, and there you can see on color, you can see that there is antegrade flow in the pulmonary artery, and that is narrow. Can you go to the previous slide, Aparna? And the next one.
These are actually the case ones are only these, the only black and white. So these are actually taken from Dr. Rabi's book, just to show the diagnostic clues which are important in a case of TOF.
Yeah. I just want to show that the previous one. Yeah. The next one. Yeah. See, this is this is what. Okay. What I'm trying to say is that there is an obtuse angle between the interventricular septum and the anterior wall of the aorta. And in cases where there is a mala line VSD with override, you find that the aorta is actually parallel to the interventricular septum. So this actually gives us a clue that we are dealing with an override. I'll stop here because there is a full-fledged lecture later on. We save some time and we can spend some more time on counseling aspect here.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So now from here we move on to our fetal medicine expert. So Vivek, what would you like to comment on this particular aspect of TOF?
Yes, Aparna, generally conotruncal anomalies we know are significantly associated with other abnormalities. Could be intracardiac, could be extracardiac, could be chromosomal. And if you take tetralogy of Fallot as a case in point, now any fetus with the tetralogy of Fallot, there are a couple of things that you would want to look for inside the heart. One, a lot of them have an association, if you go back to the previous slide, with a right aortic arch in up to around 25% cases. Some of them might show a persistently persistent left superior vena cava, and occasionally you might see an AVSD as well. So these are things that you would look for inside the heart. Extracardiac anomalies again are quite common, and there is a 30% association. Next slide, please. With chromosomal abnormalities. Yes, but when you say there is a 30% association, we need to remember that not all chromosomal abnormalities that you find with TOF are 22q deletions. In fact, it is 3 common trisomies that are much more common than Dijot syndrome with tetralogy of Fallot. So you need to look for markers of the common trisomies first, but also simultaneously look for features that could suggest Dijot syndrome in these babies. Especially remember to look at the thymus in the 3-vessel trachea view, or maybe even in the right aortic arch view. Right outflow tract view, as Professor Rabi has shown in one of his papers on assessing the thymus. So if you find clues to these, you would definitely think in terms of a Dijot syndrome. But in any case, what we need to understand is that the association with Dijot would rather depend on the subtype of TOF that we are dealing with. If it is a TOF with pulmonary stenosis, the association is not very high, somewhere around 10 to 15% as they've shown here. But if it is TOF pulmonary atresia or TOF with an absent pulmonary valve, then the association is much higher, somewhere, if I remember right, is as high as around 30-40% with absent pulmonary valve. So all cases of tetralogy of Fallot, there is, of course, a case in point to do an amniocentesis. And of course, because we are also concerned about a microdeletion here in terms of Dijot, you would definitely do a microarray. But if you're not doing a microarray, you're doing a karyotype instead, please also do a FISH for 22q deletions. And again, as we said with the other 2 conditions, you would want to definitely store DNA, because there are single gene disorders that are known to be associated, particularly conotruncal anomalies are the heart defects that you would associate with syndromes like the CHARD syndrome, or the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome here example is another example where you would find, apart from the cardiac conditions, you might find vertebral anomalies, and more classically, you might find an absent gallbladder in a lot of these cases. Aparna.
So thank you, Vivek. So now, Bijoy, so the patient would again come to you and say that, okay, how frequently do I have to come, and what is my risk of recurrence? So Bijoy, what would you have to say to that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is about the follow-up part. And when you're following up a patient with tetralogy of Fallot, it's basically on the pulmonary artery, on the size of the pulmonary artery. Now, here there are two things, the two concepts that I want to make clear. One is because of the increased flow that you get into the aorta, you can get a progressively smaller pulmonary artery, which becomes progressive across gestations, and probably you will get reversal in the duct towards term. But there is another entity where there is a congenital malformation at the infundibulum or the pulmonary valve. So these are the ones that you're going to pick up early as a severe TOF at around 18 or 19 or 20 weeks. They behave differently from the ones that have just a perimembranous VSD, and where you have the classical concept of form of flow follows function. So you have increased flow, and then finally the flow decreases across the pulmonary artery and they become smaller. So if you find that you have a severe TOF, like at 18 to 19 weeks, like with pulmonary atresia or an absent pulmonary wall, so you're looking at some problem that is there along with your perimembranous VSD that is affecting the valvular apparatus of the right side. So then the prognosis is definitely bad, and those are the conditions that you might not want to continue. But if you have just a perimembranous VSD with override, and you're seeing that there is a good sized pulmonary artery, then you follow up these pregnancies, looking at the pulmonary artery, and more than measurements, I usually rely on the flow across the ductus. And if you find that the ductus is reversing, that is when I would say that this is becoming a little bit more serious and would require immediate postnatal care. Yeah. And as far as recurrence is concerned, it depends upon what you pick up on your microarray or associated abnormalities, whether there is a syndromic association. That's what defines the recurrence. Otherwise, you have still the baseline recurrence of around 1 to 5% for any kind of congenital heart disease. Yeah.
So thank you, Bijoy, for that. And now we come to Dr. UP Singh, sir. We want to know, how would the disease behave postnatally, and what are the, how would you counsel the patient regarding the postnatal behavior and the surgery and, the survival of the baby post-surgery?
Perfect. I think Vijay already illustrated the very first question, that is the disease likely to progress? Yes, in some it can, but it can. If it does, then if you do find a reversal of flow, then you know that this is going to be a duct-dependent circulation. And the question is that where should the delivery be done? Should it be done in a tertiary care center? In majority of TOF patients, I don't think so this is required. But in patients where you do see a kind of a reversal of flow, like those who developed into a pulmonary atresia, then they would, because that's a ductal dependent circulation. And TOF with absent pulmonary valve is another problem where, the child can have immediate respiratory problem. So because of the compression of the bronchi, that's another situation. Now let's talk to the third question, that operability. Is it operable? Yes, it is. It is perfectly operable. The classic TOF surgery is now refined, and the only problem happens in a severe pulmonary stenosis or some inadequate situations, comorbid, where we need VT shunt, and Dr. Balu probably would take care of that. And if you talk about the outcome is actually excellent. I mean, majority of the actual survival is close to 90%. And the variables there are, again, the size of the pulmonary artery and the type of surgery which was done. If you've done an annuloplasty with a patch and sacrifice the pulmonary valve, then the likelihood is that the child would have a severe pulmonary regurgitation, causing RV dysfunction, functional capacity problems. So barring that, the outcome and the quality of life in patients is really good. Most of the children, those who have lost the growth restriction was there, they catch up after surgery in about 4 or 5 years time. And usually multiple surgeries are not required unless you've done a BT shunt first and then TOF correction for some reasons, or TOF with the patient, those who have a pulmonary regurgitation, those heart RV is not doing so well, you might require a pulmonary valve replacement. The outlook in general in this patient is another common cardiac condition you've discussed, is really okay.
Right. Thank you, sir. And I think that was quite a clear message that you gave. So, Dr. Rima, coming to you, so what would be your options and how would you counsel the patient regarding pregnancy management?
Yeah, so the first thing is that we need to know that if there is cerebropulmonary atresia, we need to tell them about the bad prognosis, need to counsel them about the lifelong follow-up of the child and need for surgery. This needs to be told. I would definitely do invasive testing for this patient, microarray with DNA storage. The place of delivery would definitely be a cardiac center, and also that if this baby is 22q positive, there's chances of immunocompromise, and that's the time when you need irradiated blood. You need a center where you have the facilities of all this available to you. Timing of delivery would definitely be term. The mode of delivery would be vaginal. Cesarean section would only be for a maternal indication. And in this case, we would definitely offer a cesarean section in case there is fetal distress during the intrapartum period. So that's how I would like to manage my patient.
Thank you, Dr. Rima. And before we end this case here, I would just like Dr. Balu to comment, because this is very important for the obstetricians and management of pregnancy, that what are the markers which would predict the need for neonatal intervention, because then that would decide the place of delivery and also the need for neonatal intervention. Dr. Balu, please.
Aparna, how many people are listening to me? 1,500?
So close
Okay.
to, yeah.
Okay, I will put what you have put the title now, markers predicting the need for neonatal intervention. That's the right one. Till now, you were telling the same thing as markers of poor prognosis. Okay, a critical pulmonic stenosis, near pulmonary atresia, these are all poor prognosis. I don't agree with that. This just tells you that the baby is likely to be critical at birth and needs a newborn intervention. Okay, that's all. You do a newborn intervention well, the child is saved and can go for a subsequent procedure. Now, as you correctly have written here, a small pulmonary artery, typically which is less than half the size of aorta. More specific is the Z-scores of the pulmonary valve, which is getting more and more smaller. The most useful, of course, is the direction of flow in the ductus arteriosus. Whenever there is a reverse flow, that means that there is a high probability of a duct-dependent circulation. What we do for such babies, these are the only ones which needs to be delivered in a cardiac center. Others can all safely be delivered in the hospital, in the maternity hospitals. And if there is duct-dependent circulation in a TOF, what we do is we usually start prostaglandin. And in the current era where there is a pediatric cardiology setup is available, the palliation is usually catheter-based in the newborn. Either we balloon the pulmonary valve and open it up so that the stenosis is reduced and there is more flow and cyanosis is reduced, or alternatively, we may do a ductal stenting procedure. We have done something like 150 procedures in America, the ductal stenting or the pulmonary valve dilatation. Usually it works very well. It gives us about 3 to 4 months, and then the child goes for a definitive surgery between 3 to 6 months of age. And then the long-term prognosis is exactly same as the pink TOF. As UP Singh said, long run, some of the patients may need a pulmonary valve replacement, but nowadays the surgeons are very, very careful in preserving the pulmonary valve so that the degree of regurgitation is less in the current era. So the need for pulmonary valve replacements also come down. Long run, most of the tetralogies do very well. So if there are no genetic associations, this is again a very good heart defect for correction.
So thank you, sir. So the passion to save those babies is coming through when you speak. So I hope we do get the correct referrals on time and we are able to manage a few more babies when we are actually creating more awareness on the availability and the need for neonatal intervention. So coming to the next case, just summarizing, we need to look at the cardiac extracardiac genetic association, which would be there in this case. Does this warrant a termination TOF? No, unless the poor prognostic factors, as we've really seen, but unless, and as I've said, it is possible, and neonatal intervention is what we need to look at. In utero follow-up is required, and it might need a critical perinatal intervention. So place and time of delivery really needs to be decided and followed up. So typical diagnosis is Dr. Rabi's talk, 4-chamber view is probably, not a very good view now. The things are changing. So, this is what the message should go. So now this is the last case that we would be discussing. So coming to Dr. Bimal back again, sir. Now this is our image to you.
Yeah, okay. The first image is showing me that both the outflow tracks are parallel to each other. They are not crossing each other, because normally we want the LVOT and the RVOT to cross each other as they leave their respective ventricles. And in the 3-vessel view, I'm seeing only one great artery and the SVC. So, now both these things, now I have two things in my mind that I can think of as a TGA or a DORV. So now I need to go further. So, and even in practice, these are the two findings which actually strike you, because that we need to go further, and then we really have to go systematically and see, because the goal, what was important for me here is that the artery which is arising from the LV, is it really the aorta? So what I have to look for is whether there is a ventriculo-arterial concordance or not. And in most of these cases of in the TGA, what you get is that the artery which is arising from the left ventricle, actually, as it leaves the left ventricle, branches. So that is the pulmonary artery, whereas the artery which arises from the right ventricle is the aorta. So that is a ventriculo-arterial discordance, and that is telling us this is a TGA. And I'm not getting too much into the depth of it, because we have a lecture on outflow tracks where the master will take you through.
Master will take us through. Yes, sir, we are awaiting those lectures. So, sir, so the next point that we come to is our genetic cardiac extracardiac association. So, Vivek, can we have your opinion on this?
Yes, Aparna. We know that there are, you could probably classify TGAs with VSTs and TGAs without VSTs. So you call them as TGAs with intact septum, and the other half you have TGAs with VSTs. So VSTs are quite common in association, intracardiac association of TGAs. As you have said here, around 40%. They're typically perimembranous, but having said that, you could see VSDs, even muscular VSDs in association with transposition. So the site really does not matter, but most commonly, or most typically, you would expect to see a perimembranous VSD. And when you have a VSD, the chances that there is an associated pulmonary stenosis is also quite high. You could have right ventricular outflow tract obstruction as high as around 30%. But remember that PS can also, pulmonary stenosis can also be a part of TGAs with intact septum. However, when you see that as part of an intact septum, the severity tends to be generally lesser than when you have it in association with the TGA with VSD. Apart from that, I think extracardiac anomalies are extremely rare, as you've mentioned here. Trisomies are quite uncommon, and even the case of DiGeorge syndrome is quite rare with a simple DTGA. So I would say that the question of further testing, genetic testing, is optional. But of course, if you have a TGA that is complex, or if you have extracardiac abnormalities, then there's no question you would want to do an invasive testing for microarray and DNA storage.
Thank you, Vivek. I think that was simple. And as we mentioned, this is one of those cardiac anomalies where probably the genetic association is a bit less if it is actually a simple TGA. Now, coming to Bijoy. So why do we need a prenatal follow-up in this case? And what is the risk of recurrence?
The follow-up is actually different for plain TGA and TGA with VSD. I want to just stress that. So if you have a TGA with VSD, your follow-up is going to be slightly different, because when you have a VSD, especially when it's in the outlet region or the perimembranous region, the infundibulum can sort of gravitate towards the center and obstruct the outflow that is coming out from the left, which is the pulmonary artery. So in those cases, you're going to get pulmonary stenosis. So whenever you have an outlet septum defect or a perimembranous septal defect with TGA, it's very, very important to look at the pulmonary artery, because that can be stenotic. The second thing that you need to look at in simple TGA or plain TGA without a VSD is that you have to remember that the duct is now, the ductus arteriosus is now receiving blood from the left ventricle. And the left ventricle is receiving purely oxygenated blood from the ductus venosus, which goes through the foramen ovale, goes into the left atrium, goes into the left ventricle, and then comes out through the aorta. Now through the pulmonary artery. So now the pulmonary artery is having a higher oxygen concentration than it should have in normal conditions. And we know that the duct is highly sensitive to oxygen saturation. And so what happens is that towards term, this duct begins to constrict because the oxygen concentration in the duct is now at least 2 times higher than what it should have normally been. And when it constricts, it increases the flow into the lungs, because now the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery will take more blood flow, and thereby it will increase the return into the LA. And the increase of blood return into the LA will cause what? It will cause constriction of the foramen ovale. So a combination of these two things can happen: a constriction of the duct and a constriction of the foramen ovale. And it's important to understand that this happens towards the later part of pregnancy, because that is when the saturation changes become more significant. And that's why after 30 weeks is when you will expect to see a ductal constriction or a foramen ovale constriction. And this happens only 20% of the time. But still, it is important to look out for them, because when this happens, this fetus will require immediate neonatal intervention.
Right.
So that's an important point in that. And as far as recurrence, again, as Vivek clearly mentioned, the associations are very, very rare. And so you can, if there are no other chromosomal issues or no extracardiac malformations present, I would say again the same background risk of around 1 to 5% would be present for these conditions as well.
Right. Thank you, Bijoy. So I will quickly go to Dr. UP Singh to just share about what is the prognosis of this cardiac disorder and the treatment options which are available.
Bijoy has done a wonderful job by telling that, look for certain things in the antenatal period, particularly with TGA, with the VSD. But VSD is a savior here. It makes your life easy, but maybe a little difficult for the surgeon. But if you have a TGA with no VSD, that is intact interventricular septum, the delivery has to be done in a tertiary care center, because the child is going to be cyanotic and there is no mixing of the blood. We need to have that mixing of the blood, and the majority of the places it is done by a balloon atrioplasty. And if you do a ballooning, you try to create an ASD and try to create a admixture. Or now is surgery possible? Yes, it's a corrective surgery is possible. There are many variables, but in a common garden variety of a TGA without a VSD, the surgery outcome is very good. Usually single surgery is required. Multiple surgeries are not required unless once you've transplanted the coronaries, they have some problem as the child grows. There is a competition between should we do atrial septostomy or go ahead with the surgery of a TGA, because now the TGA surgery is being done in a neonatal period and as early as possible, because the longer, I think one message which probably the person who is counseling the pregnant woman has to be given, that time is very important. We can tell the patient that, okay, the child does require surgery, but in India, we need to tell them that the surgery has to be done early, because if it's done late, the LV actually regresses and the outcome is poor, because many of the patients would actually go elsewhere, talk to so many people, and they're lost actually that it has to be done. Again, in the outcome, the neurocognitive abnormalities are very common in a patient where, you all know that the brain actually starts developing from 3 weeks and continue in till the adulthood, early adulthood. And it has been seen that if you do a surgery of a VSD versus do a surgery of TOF over this TGA, and you have a different outcomes of neurocognitive functions, their learning abilities and things like that, that I think in the part of the counseling needs to be told
Right.
to them. Right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So I think I will now ask Dr. Balu to summarize this TGA part, but I think because I think their centers are doing great numbers of TGA, and I think this is a very, very crucial part of correctable lesion that needs to be addressed. Dr. Balu.
Okay, so you have a set of questions. Site of delivery, I think irrespective of what you say about whether foramen ovale is restrictive or not in utero, I will say that all TGAs should be delivered in a pediatric cardiac facility. There is no question about that. the predictability of in utero shunts is absolutely horrendous. And there are cases where I have said septostomy will be needed and it was not needed. There has been cases where I have said it looks good, septostomy was needed. So it's completely unpredictable. So I don't think it's good to look for that, but it doesn't determine the site of delivery. Timing of delivery, very important. Never, if possible, deliver a TGA prematurely. As much as possible, take the pregnancy to full term, because the outcomes are much better in a term baby. Mode of delivery, absolutely based on obstetric indications. There are very few situations where one would probably do as elective cesarean for a TGA. Maybe, I'm not an obstetrician again. If somebody has a very restrictive foramen ovale and a very restrictive ductus arteriosus, that kind of a baby will sometimes benefit by a very planned obstetric care. Now, planning the immediate postnatal care is what I do. And if the baby is delivered in a pediatric cardiac center, so this is a paper which we published about the transport. Most of the things which you'll be seeing about poor neurocognitive outcomes in TGA are related to factors like this. Baby goes through this period of intense cyanosis during transport, and then already a lot of brain damage is sustained before operation. So if you can actually diagnose prenatally and plan the delivery in a cardiac center, this can be avoided. The preoperative status is better. Surgery can be done early. There is only one surgery people do these days for TGA, which is arterial switch operation. And our center, our preferred timing is 3rd day after birth. 42% of our prenatal TGAs has had surgery within the first 3 days of life. And 88% had surgery within the first 10 days of life. And only a very few of prenatal TGAs had operations after 10 days. So TGA is one lesion, if you can diagnose prenatally, can completely make the transformation from a universally fatal disease to a totally correctable problem with excellent outcomes. Regarding neurocognitive development, one of my first transpositions, he's 20 years old now, which underwent switch in our center. He has joined medical college and he's a 2nd year medical student. So I think he has reasonably decent neurocognitive outcomes. So the neurocognitive outcomes are principally decided by the preoperative state and not necessarily the surgical, surgical morbidities. So the message is very simple: diagnose TGA, refer in utero, deliver in cardiac center, and go for early surgical correction. So this slide, you want me to say this or you will say this, Aparna?
So please carry on.
Right. So the excellent prognosis, I think we are not going to talk about ASDs or VSDs. These can be very well diagnosed after birth. And coarctation, yes, if you can diagnose coarctation is great. TAPVC is one diagnosis which can make a big difference, but very rarely is it diagnosed in utero. I think Dr. Rabi will talk about that later. Generally, most of the situations like TOF, TGA, majority of DORVs, AVSDs all do very well. The risk of reoperations is about 10% in all this. Situations like TOF, pulmonary atresia, common arterial trunk, single ventricles like tricuspid atresia, double inlet LV, etc., they do reasonably well. Most of them will need multiple staged operations. And some of them like double inlet LV, tricuspid atresia are all single ventricles, but these are the best single ventricles. We can expect about 85% adult survival. Reoperations are universal in this group. For me, the poor outcomes are basically 2 or 3. Hypoplastic left heart syndrome, complex heterotaxis, and very complex forms of pulmonary atresias. And these are the ones where I think we should endeavor to diagnose them early in life, early during pregnancy, so that option of termination can be offered to these patients. So I think this is what we discussed. We should always begin the counseling with as fetus as a whole. The 4-chamber view is extremely important because it will help us to differentiate between hearts which can be corrected from the hearts which can be palliated. Outflow tract number, in utero progression, and of course, for somebody like me, the critical newborn presentation with either transposition or duct-dependent circulation. I think this is a good message. I have used this slide in several lectures of mine all over. I think what we should do in India now, as we have so much of expertise and more expertise is developing, is that every pregnancy should have a fetal heart evaluation and try to diagnose the problems early. Complex heart defects, we can diagnose, counsel, and within 20 weeks, termination option can be considered if the family doesn't want to continue. But for somebody like me, who's a practicing pediatric cardiologist, critical heart defects which are correctable can be offered planned peripartum care. And this will ensure that we have the best possible outcomes for these cases. Thank you for letting me speak on, in fact, my slides, the last 3 ones. And I think you did a great job, Aparna. And thanks for the other panelists. So I'll hand over to you for summing up this session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And I would ask Dr. Khurana, if we are running too late, then we can just wind up the session, or do we have a few questions? If it is permission, we can take, or maybe we can take it as we go on.
I think we'll take them as we go on.
Yes, sir. So just let me just wind it up. I would like to thank all the panelists for being so interactive and giving their opinion, and it's been a great experience. Thank you to SFM for this panel, and 2 acknowledgements that I would like to say is, one is to Dr. Balu for helping me with this panel, and also to Dr. Rabi, because the images are from his textbook, as we say, that is the Bible for fetal cardiology. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for being a part of this panel.